I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists.
Thank you, Tucker, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's personally exciting to be able to talk to you about this topic, especially here in this region. The Sonoma and Marin coastlines is where I learned how to dive. My family would go camping, we would hunt for food. It's where I grew up and learned to love the ocean. And I came back here to learn how to be a science diver 5 years after that. So I'm really excited to be able to tell you about the structure of kelp forests. So what am I saying today? I'm going to tell you what kelp forests are, and then what lives in them. A lot of the life in the ocean can feel very alien to people, and I would say it breaks a lot of the rules that we think of animals, especially when we think of ourselves and from our own perspective. And finally, how do we study kelp forests? How do we learn about this other ecosystem? How do we go into the water? How do we collect the information, and how are we saying what we know? Kelp forests look like this to many people. This is from the surface, this is a satellite image, and this is the kelp forest canopy. This is what we see at the top, or if we walk to our coastlines. And this image extends all along the coast of California. Kelp forests in our region extend from Baja to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, but kelp forests are something that are worldwide. Essentially, if you look at a map of the ocean, anywhere that's on the right side of the ocean probably has kelp forests. So us, South America and Chile, places in South Africa, essentially all it needs is cold water and lots of nutrients. And this is what kelp forests look like underwater. These big pillars and almost like a cathedral of big green stalks of kelp with lots of fish and lots of color. And it's always in these cold water regions, anywhere from 60 feet to as shallow as 10 feet. Essentially, where is their light and where will it not be ripped out by waves before it can pass on the next generation? And today I'm going to tell you about the structure of the ecosystem. So I'm going to focus on 4 different lifestyles. We have filter feeders, things that eat plankton, which I will define a little bit later. We have predators, those that are actively hunting, seeking out their food and picking off parts of the population to help keep balance. And grazers. On land, we think of them as like cows and deer, things that eat a lot of plants. But underwater, they have a unique role of cleaning rocks and making it a new place for organisms to land. And finally, the primary producers. Things are getting the energy from the sun. Things like plants on land. But underwater, there's only one true plant in the ocean, which is seagrass. Everything else falls under this group called algae. Life in the ocean is really weird. So thinking from our perspective, 97% of the animal kingdom does not have bones, which is already unique to us. And most of the components that we think of as required become optional or rare or proven to not be needed. So like, let's take the brain, or even nervous system, or even nerves. All of those things are sometimes just not needed for an organism to be successful. And successful is a term that I use here as if life was a strategy game. The strategy is not to be the last animal standing or the biggest. It's, can I get somewhere, get enough food, and then pass on my genes to the next generation? And any organism that does that is successful. To be successful, you don't even need blood. At the end of the day, it's just a liquid that's bringing oxygen to your muscles, and some sea creatures think seawater is just good enough. Your eyes, most of the animal kingdom has not decided they need to see and have not evolved to do so. A skeleton, we think of that as bones, but other organisms use shells, an exoskeleton, or kind of an outer body like ants, or even water to create their physical structure. A separate entrance for food and your waste. We are all very happy that we have this, but some of the animal kingdom is just shaped like a cup. Food goes in, anything they don't want goes back out. And often on land, you look for a reproductive partner nearby. How do you find a mate? Underwater, they have seawater. You just kind of release everything and that hope it finds a match in most cases, because a lot of things are just stuck to the rock. One of the reasons that ocean life is really weird is because most of the animals have a larval stage. And what this means is that when what you released finds its partner and they make a baby organism, most of them start off in this weird shaped stage. And this floats around in the water and it makes what plankton is. So all of these small animals or the larval stages of bigger ones, and they often take very alien shapes and forms. And this is the first feeding style, the kind of gatekeepers, because underwater, these larvae need a place to land. But before that, they have to contend with all these other things trying to eat them. And they're really nutritious, and there's so much of it that the biggest animals on our planet have evolved just to rely on that alone. Whales. And all of these species that I'll be showing you beyond the whale exist in kelp forests. So they're all off our coastline and local to our region. This lifestyle is unique to aquatic settings because on land, there is not enough structure in the air to be able to carry stuff except for things like pollen and plants. So if you can imagine, it'd be like that, but all made up of baby animals. I'd like to introduce you to your closest relative that is spineless. These are the tunicates, and they are the closest relative to us that does not have bones or a spine, but they do have something called a notochord, like your spinal cord. You can kind of see that if you look at its larvae there on the top left, or top right, apologies. And it kind of looks like a tadpole or a fish. But these are filter feeders. They're pulling in water through one of these pores. Well, I guess I have a laser. Through one of these pores and shooting out all the rest and taking in just the small animals behind. They form bigger colonies because it helps them bring more food in as identical groups and just be more successful. This strategy of filter feeding and tunicates have done so well, they've left the need to have rock, and they form these big free-floating colonies that move through the ocean and just filter water. Each of those on this left picture is about 12 to 18 inches, and there are long chains of them that can reach up to 100 feet. Next one I have for you is barnacles, and most people look at this and think, it might be a clam or a shellfish, or it might be an alien creature. It's actually related to a crab or an insect or a spider. It's part of that group. Inside of this home that it builds is a small crab-like creature, almost like a hermit crab, but it builds its shell, and it sticks out these tentacles that catch a lot of food. The worms are in this game with filter feeder worms, and you might recognize some of these as inspiration for things from the movie Avatar, but they build tubes and stick out tentacles to catch the small animals swimming by. Sea anemones and jellyfish are also part of this, and this is the stereotype for the cup-shaped animal. Food goes in that thing, comes right back out the top. But they have one of the fastest biological actions in the animal kingdom. And the thing that I'm showing you there on the right is a cell. It's their stinging cell. So if you ever touched a sea anemone or been stung by a jellyfish, what is happening is you're triggering a small hair-like trigger, and that is ejecting a harpoon, truly looks like one, into your skin. If you ever touched a sea anemone, it might feel sticky, and that's because you're pulling out all of those harpoons when you move away. They're just not strong enough to get through our skin. The next group of animals is one that I even hemmed and hawed about putting in this presentation because I feel like I have a hard time convincing you that that's alive or an animal. But these are the bryozoans, and they come in a bunch of different shapes and forms. And what they are is a small animal that builds a box in a colony, and it has a lid. And it opens that lid and sticks tentacles out to catch food swimming by. And I show you all these different filter feeders because when there's a big diversity of animals, it means that there's a big resource to take advantage of. So all of this diversity is just a small snapshot, but all of these organisms are successful, and they come from so many branches of the tree of life, which implies that there are so many plankton out there. The next group is predators, things that eat grazers, eat filter feeders, eat each other, and they're essential for an ecosystem. Having tiers or big diversity of them implies that the ecosystem is really, really healthy or really, really productive. And they range from small creatures like this goby up to great white sharks. The scariest one of invertebrates are the sea stars. Impressive predators that rip open the shells of other organisms, eject their stomach into that shell, and dissolve the animal and eat it from inside of its own home. They're relatively indiscriminate. They eat anything they can get their hands on, and it's truly terrifying to me. I'm glad they're not bigger. Sea slugs. On land, they're kind of a garden nuisance. They eat a lot of plants. But underwater, they're predators, eating small things like those bryozoans or small immature stages that have already landed. And they come in a variety of colors and shapes, which again implies that huge, big diversity. They're really good at what they do. All of them have really bright colors, or at least for the most part, and that's because of what they eat. So if you go to a tide pool and you see a really pink algae or a kind of thing growing on the rock, and you see the really, really pink nudibranch or the sea slug, you can probably assume that that's what it eats. Worms. There are true worms in the ocean that are also predators, so they have these jaws and they get up to a foot. They have iridescent colors, but don't worry, if you go in the water, none of these will mess with you. They have a job. But you see that one there on the bottom right actually uses a lure. It has a piece of its body that extends out and baits in small organisms and then pulls it in and grabs them with its jaws. It's pretty terrifying. The last group is the grazers, the cleanup crew, and they're very important for biological ecosystems. They're eating all the leftover material. But like I said, underwater, there's this huge larval stage. I keep harping on it. And that needs a place to settle. And these organisms go through and scrape the rock clean, which make it a new place for a new organism to find and land. The first group that I want to talk about is the snails. There's a huge diversity of them. They almost have a chainsaw-like tongue that scrapes the bottom of the rock, and they mow around eating algae or kind of just cleaning it up. And we have some of the biggest snails in California in the case of abalone, which are there on the bottom right, getting up to at least a foot in some cases, if not bigger. That's their larval stage at the top. I just think it's very cute. I like to showcase. The most famous one is the sea urchin, which mouth is on the bottom and are powerful jaws as it moves around. So it goes through clearing space of other invertebrates or rock-dwelling creatures and kind of mows the ground. And other organisms even evolve to follow them in this space and almost farm the empty ground so that they can keep eating things that land. At the bottom of the ecosystems are the primary producers. And in this case, I want to focus on kelp. Kelp is a big stand-building part of algae, and it is not a plant. It's actually a colonial organism that makes this shape. So kind of think of the algae that would grow in a pool, or the small fine green stuff that you would find in a river. Very related to this. And kelp is something called a foundational species. And a foundational species is one that disproportionately affects the environment around it. What you see here is something called a holdfast, and while it may look like roots, this is where the kelp grabs onto the rocky bottom. And it does so because it grows really fast and gets to the surface, up to 18 inches a day at its peak growth. But kelp gets ripped out seasonally. They get so big, and in the winter, these storms rip through. But the reoccurrence of kelp and the presence of kelp is essential for all of this diversity that I showed you. Other foundational species are things like sequoias, redwoods, coral reefs, mangroves. Essentially, if we're naming an ecosystem after a single type of species, you can probably assume that it's a foundational one. But unfortunately, kelp forests have not been doing too well. What you can see here is the impacts of the loss of a kelp forest there on the right. So at the surface, this canopy goes away. At the mid-level, there becomes a lot less diversity and single amounts of species that are surviving. And at the bottom, the rock gets scraped clean because this is a cause of urchin explosion, or an increase of their presence into something called an urchin barren. And this has occurred all across California. These are just sites from the Sonoma and Mendocino region, but we have lost 90% of our kelp cover across the extent of our coastline. And while this map ends at 2016, I can promise you that we have not seen a drastic recovery. The reason this happened is because of something called the blob, which in 2014, 2015 was a major heating wave that moved up and down the California coastline and created conditions that were impossible for kelp to live. Essentially, it was too hot. This coincided with a wasting disease in sea stars, which I told you they're very important predators, as well as a really hard El Nino winter storms that ripped out any of the kelp that was surviving. And it turned into what looks like this. So on one side you see an urchin barren, on the other you see a kelp forest. And this is where my research comes in. I am an ecologist, and I'm really interested in how ecosystems impact each other. How do they fit together in this puzzle piece, and how are they finding this balance? How is the environment affecting the organisms, and vice versa? So my questions can be explained by this. Imagine if you're walking along a path between a meadow and a forest. If you walk into the forest, it gets dark, it gets humid, there's not a lot of plants on the ground, there's not a lot of wind. And as you leave, it might start getting brighter. You're walking towards a meadow. There's a little bit more wind, there's more plants. And then as you get farther and farther into the meadow, it gets brighter, hotter, windier, sometimes drier. These are things that we can see, but we also feel the changes, and organisms respond to these as well. You'll see predators like birds up in the trees hunting in the meadow. You see deers moving back and forth. And that's because these organisms are impacting each other, and my ecological questions are how? Underwater, this can be really hard for a number of reasons. Studying things in a marine ecosystem can just be really challenging inherently. So a lot of these questions are unanswered. But how do we do research underwater? How do we know what we know? How are we claiming to say what we are? And the first step is to change how we're adapted. We are very poorly adapted for the marine system, so we have to overcome a lot of challenges. One, it's cold, so we have to wear a wetsuit. Now we're floaty, that thing is buoyant, so we have to weigh ourselves down. Now you're just stuck at the bottom, so you have to wear an inflatable backpack. You have to fill that weight somehow, so you have an air tank that also lets you breathe. You can't see, you wear a mask, you're a bad swimmer, so you have to have fins, and you have no sense of direction. So you have a compass or devices that tell you how deep you are, how long you've been there. And suddenly we are now the loudest, slowest, least adapted animal underwater, and now it's time to do our work. research underwater kind of takes two major forms. We're either deploying instruments, so this is the work that I mentioned in Washington, or Tucker when he introduced me. You're putting them down here to understand the physical environment, things like temperature, wave velocity, the chemistry of the water. What are the conditions the organisms are dealing with? And then for ecology or biology, a lot of it is done visually, especially in the fields. And so far, I've shown you pictures and videos of kelp forests that are worth showing. But unfortunately, a lot of what happens looks like this. So this is a video from one of my research dives, and you can see it's dark. You'll see me get knocked to the left by some major currents. You have scientific equipment in your hands. You have a buddy that you have to keep track of. You have to manage your air. You have to understand how far you are and how fast you're going, and are you weighted correctly? And now you have to start counting things. How many of them? Can you identify them? I just showed you a whole bunch of creatures that are just a snapshot of my favorites. So if you imagine, you'd be swimming along here, counting, sizing, getting to understand, even identifying them can be really, really challenging. So this visual nature of ecology kind of hits a limit. We have to ask questions that are convenient. Like, we can count urchins, but a lot of those snails that I showed you can be really, really challenging to differentiate. So how do we study communities we can't see? I am pulling a lot from microbiology research or microbiome research or even soil work that looks at fungi. And all of that is done using genetics. So I'm sure all of us have spit in a tube or had our nose swabbed, and when the doctors take that away, they're running that through a chemical process that is looking for a marker in the COVID genome. Essentially, a genetic identifier that is present, and they're then diagnosing you with sickness. I'm using this from the water and the environment. If I'm taking water, it has bits of scales, mucus, kind of the waste and the food, like all of these things are leaving a genetic signature. And I am collecting that, and instead of looking for the COVID gene, I'm looking for a gene in the mitochondria. So essentially any animal or organism that is bigger than bacteria. Anything that has multiple cells will leave this presence behind, and I can identify the species to it. So that leaves us back with this problem. We have kelp forests, we have urchin barrens, and I can start to look at what organisms are where and use those patterns to understanding how these ecosystems are impacting each other. But it doesn't yet solve the problem. We still have urchin barrens spreading. We're seeing no slowdown in some of these major storms or heating waves. But my work will hopefully work towards guiding things like conservation and restoration. For example, like answering the question, would it be better to go to a place that has no more kelp, or going to a kelp forest that has been pushed back and trying to expand it? So ideally, this work can work towards guiding those resources and those efforts that are trying to protect this important ecosystem. And ideally, my research and my PhD will work at those questions. Thank you. Yes?
Are otters doing a good enough job getting rid of the urchins? Because that's what's destroying a lot of the kelp forests, right?
Yeah, you're right. Otters.
The question was what? Please repeat.
Oh, of course. Yeah. So the question was, are otters doing a good job at helping the kelp forest or eating the urchins? And the answer is yes. But they're really good at keeping the ecosystem present and not expanding it. In these urchin barrens, the urchins are essentially hibernating. They're not eating a whole lot. And the otters just don't like to eat them. So while they keep the current ecosystem present, they're doing a poor job of helping us recover the rest. Yes?
Can the urchin barrens get intervention by people, like divers who can go in and then sell the uni to sushi restaurants?
Yeah, wonderful question. So to repeat that, it was, what are we doing and how are we impacting the urchin barrens, and can we go and intervene? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, the uni farmers can't get anything, much like the otters. There's no food in these things, they're not eating. But we can go and we can remove them. Or what we've been doing in California is taking them, sending them to kelp farms, fattening them up, and then selling them. The problem is it takes a lot of hours underwater and a lot of effort. So it's been not as effective in terms of recovering whole swaths of the coastline, but it is useful. Yes?
Any progress reintroducing sea stars? I hear people are starting to grow them successfully. Is that true?
Yeah, so the question is, are we able to reintroduce the sea stars, and is anyone doing so? And the answer is yes. There's a few labs in Washington who are regrowing the most important ones, which are the sun stars. I showed an image with a whole mess of legs. Those are the biggest sea star predators. And they, I think, are at their third or fourth generation there, but not yet releasing them in the wild. I have heard rumors of them being sighted in Mendocino. So hopefully brighter futures. Yeah, one more question.
you mentioned that both the blob, the warm sea surface temperatures, and the sea star wasting disease contributed to the urchin explosion and the death of the kelp. Did the blob also cause that wasting disease in sea stars, or is that just an unrelated coincidence of time?
Yeah, great question. So the ask was the blob responsible for the sea star wasting disease? And the answer is no. It was a viral infection that began at a different time. It was just a very unfortunate coinciding. And while some viruses do better in hotter environments, I don't know exactly if that helped perpetuate the disease or if this has just been something that would have happened naturally. Because it is still sticking around in some places. Yes?
At what temperatures do the kelp beds actually flourish? Like
Mm.
what temperatures are ideal?
So a lot of the temperatures we have on the California coastline are anywhere between like 47 degrees Fahrenheit and 62. So for Celsius, that'd be somewhere between 12 and 17. And those are kind of the ideal range. And most of the time it isn't how hot it is, it's how hot for how long. So if it gets out of the range and stays there, the kelp's biological functions start to fail. And they're not as good as outcompeting some of the other algae that might be fighting for space. Yes?
How much of the biodiversity can you capture through looking for DNA?
So I'm very early in this research, but using that kind of broad search for anything with a mitochondria, I'm getting back somewhere between 450 and 600 species. The problem there is that it relies on the fact that someone has sequenced them before. So I need a reference, I need something to line it up to. So a lot of my data is actually lost, either because it's not sequenced, errors with the chemistry, or because they're species that we have not yet identified. Just want to check, did you have something to say for
No,
time?
I have a question, but audience first.
Are we letting Tucker ask?
It's a good one.
Please?
I was stunned when you said that kelp are not plants,
Mhm.
and that the only plants in the ocean are seagrasses.
Mhm.
When I look at the land, is it fair to say that the greatest of the kingdoms, plants have the greatest biomass of any kingdom on land? Why don't plants seem to succeed in the oceans?
So the question was, do plants succeed? Why are plants not succeeding in the ocean, and why is it not plants but instead algae? So that is because plants have developed a lot of the vascular parts that are important. Things like the structure of wood or veins that are moving up called capillaries that help bring water. Essentially, they're fighting gravity. Underwater, algae doesn't have that problem, and they've outcompeted a lot of these things by not needing to rely on moving different transports around. So algae is just more adapted and have evolved to be more suited.
Partly because water is a better medium for moving nutrients, say, than the air is.
Exactly. So the plants have had to overcome challenges, and they did so really, really well, and were able to take off. But algae got there first in the ocean and have continued to outcompete.
Thank you.
Yes?
If kelp is algae, then why does it take the shape of like the plant, like with the leaves and stuff?
That's a great question. So on land, the question was, why does kelp take the shape that it does? Why does it look like plants with these leaves? And the answer is, that's a really good shape. Plants have gotten successful as they are on land, partly because they're good at capturing the sun. And that shape is very similar underwater. And they also have this form so that they can be resistant to getting ripped out by water or storms. So they're very hydrodynamic, which is a similar problem on land, helping resist wind and air. So the answer is, they both came to the same conclusion through evolution.
All right. Whoop.
Oh, one more. Yes, please.
So algae, just like plants, remove CO2 from, well, in this case, the water, not the atmosphere. What effect does that have on the oxygenation of the water? Because they would produce oxygen then.
Yeah, so the question was...
Oxygen-treated water for your coastlines?
Yeah, so the question was, do kelp remove or add oxygen to the water and remove carbon? And the answer to your question is yes for both. So like plants on land, they undergo photosynthesis. So during the day, they're releasing oxygen and taking in carbon to grow. And they do so from the air and the water, actually. But then at night, that's still an organism that needs to respire. So it has biological functions that's still happening. So then it's uptaking oxygen and releasing carbon. The answer is, as a net, it's taking in more carbon than it's releasing. and it's releasing more oxygen than it's using. So kelp is actually one of the missions in terms of green carbon. So removing carbon from the atmosphere. Kelp is really good at doing that and distributing it back to animals as a source of nutrients.
All right, as we prepare for the second talk in this Ask a Science Envoy presentation, how about a round of applause? I mentioned this program, this one of 3 programs that Wonderfest produces called Ask a Science Envoy. These guys are Science Envoys, and they have presentations here for Wonderfest, but they also have interviews with radio station KPOO FM in San Francisco. Its subheading is Poor People's Radio, but their signal is strong and bright and rich. So please think about looking that up. Okay, you can hear previous interviews of Science Envoy speakers there at Wonderfest website. Now, Natasha Abrams is a researcher and 4th-year PhD student at UC Berkeley, the astronomy department. She is searching for and studying black holes via gravitational microlensing, and she will explain what that means, of course. Before coming to Cal, Natasha earned her bachelor's degree at Harvard in physics and astrophysics. Natasha tells me in her bio sketch that she is passionate about teaching and mentoring. You and I will benefit from those passions right now. Please welcome astrophysicist and Wonderfest Science Envoy, Natasha Abrams.
Awesome, thanks, and thanks for having me. We have the power to discover black holes, even though we can't see them. We can find those just from a few times the mass of our sun to billions of times the mass of our sun. We're going to talk about what a black hole is and various ways we find them. Let's get into it.
Okay, let me just move your mic a little closer. You're doing
So first off, what is a black hole? A black hole is a point of immense density. It's taking the mass from a few times the mass of our sun to billions of times the mass of our sun and squeezing it into a point. And that point then is so massive and so dense that even light can't escape the gravitational pull. It also curves the space-time around it, as you can see here in this artist's representation. And that is described by general relativity. So let's talk about an anatomy of a black hole. So a key concept to understanding this is understanding the escape velocity or escape speed. When I'm on Earth and I jump, I don't go flying off into space because Earth's gravity pulls me back down. Whereas we do have things that can escape Earth's gravity. We have rockets that can go fast enough that can escape Earth's gravitational pull and go off into space. In the case of a black hole, not even light is fast enough to escape the gravitational pull, and therefore black holes look black. Light from them doesn't get to us. In addition, light is the cosmic speed limit. Nothing can go faster than the speed of light, and therefore nothing can escape a black hole. The point at which you aren't able to escape the black hole is called the event horizon. And the point in the center of infinite density is known as the singularity. The first type of black holes we're going to talk about are astrophysical black holes, or stellar mass black holes. These come from exploding stars that have collapsed in on themselves and exploded and left behind a remnant core that's a black hole. And these are called stellar mass black holes since they're around the mass of a star. So let's talk about how we detect stellar mass black holes. So the first method I'll talk about is X-ray binaries. These are when you have a black hole and a star that are orbiting one another, what's called a binary. And this star is a giant star, and so it's having a hard time holding on to its outer layers since they're pretty far. And then it gets close enough to a black hole, the black hole starts pulling material off of it and accreting it around it in what's called an accretion disk. And that material will then start to glow. since what happens is there's friction in that disk. The same way if you rub your hands together, they heat up, and that would glow in the infrared if we had an infrared camera. This is happening on a much more energetic scale, and so this will actually glow in the X-rays, and we can actually detect that. These are the same sorts of X-rays that if you go to the doctor with a broken bone, they'll bombard your arm with X-rays and you can see the bone inside. These are producing those powerful photons that are getting to us, and we're actually able to detect those companions. And so using this method, we found about 20 black holes between 3 and 23 times the mass of our sun. These were mostly found in the 1970s and are all within our own galaxy, the Milky Way. So these are only a very specific kind of configuration. You need to have a black hole and a giant star that need to be close enough together that the black hole is accreting mass from that companion star. And so there are other methods to find black holes in other configurations. So the next method I'm going to talk about are gravitational waves. And so when you have two black holes that are orbiting each other in a binary, this sort of configuration can arise. These are when they're very close together and they're going to be spiraling in towards each other. They lose energy, and that energy, instead of producing as heat or something else, is produced as gravitational waves. And in this artist representation, you can see the spirals of these ripples of gravitational waves. And that's actually stretching and compressing the space that we're in. It's on its tiniest scale that you can't feel it, but if a black hole merge together, you actually are getting bigger and smaller in a very small way. And so we're able to detect these using LIGO, which is known as the Laser Interferometric Gravitational Wave Observatory. And so doing so, we've detected almost 200 pairs of black holes. And I think I forgot to mention these are going closer and closer and closer, and then eventually they'll merge to become one black hole. And so the way to read this plot, this is a representation of all the black holes we found using this method. And the x-axis here, so this axis is meaningless, it's just for aesthetics. But this axis here, the y-axis, is the mass of your object. So let's look at one example. This is one black hole of about 7 times the mass of our sun, plus one black hole that's 11 times the mass of our sun, to form this black hole that's nearly 20 times the mass of our sun. And so each of these lines are 2 black holes merging to form one larger black hole. And again, though, this is only a very specific configuration. You need 2 black holes that are orbiting each other, that are very close to each other, that are merging on a human timescale. That's not the case for most objects. Most black holes that are in binaries are in what's called detached systems. They're just orbiting, potentially with another star, potentially with another black hole, and they're just orbiting around, minding their own business for millions of years. And so when you have a black hole plus a star, you can actually potentially find the black hole, because you can see the star just kind of orbiting around nothing. So we have had new telescopes, so the Gaia Observatory is able to measure the positions of stars very precisely. And so we can actually see stars orbiting around nothing, and that's known as finding the astrometric wobbles. And so astrometric because that's measuring the position on the sky, and wobbles because it's wobbling around. And so you can find, based on exactly how it's wobbling, the mass of the companion object, black hole. And so 3 black holes have been found using this method so far. They're all within our Milky Way. And so this is a picture of the Milky Way taken from inside of it, because that's where we are. And there are these 3 black holes that we found in it. Again, though, this requires that the black hole is in a binary system. We think that actually most black holes are on their lonesome, going through space. Very hard to detect because we can't see them. But we can notice their gravitational influence. And so the next method is gravitational lensing, which can be used to find isolated black holes. And this one is particularly near and dear to my heart. This is the one that I think about day to day. And so gravitational lensing is when light gets bent around massive objects. As I mentioned, black holes curve space-time, so do other objects as well, other massive objects. And so this is an example where Earth is over here. This is some galaxy in a cluster, so this is much more massive than the black holes we've been talking about. Galaxies are collections of stars, black holes, gas, dust, everything all together. And so you might have some galaxy in a cluster, and then you have some distant object, there might be some other galaxy. And then it gets bent around, the light from that distant object gets bent around the galaxy in a cluster, and you see these distorted images of that distant object. So if we imagine turning this so that Earth is outside of the screen, then this object here is this red galaxy is the lensing object, and this back here is actually a source galaxy. This is a galaxy that is represented by this, that is being bent, lensed by that, by the central galaxy here. And you can see the really gorgeous distorted images of that galaxy. So in the case of microlensing, you're thinking about much smaller objects. So this is, a black hole or a star, and your lens would be some black hole, and you would have some background star. These are also moving with respect to one another on human timescales. And so in this animation, we have here this yellow object representing the lens. So that could be a black hole, it could also be a star, and we're going to pretend that it's not moving, and that the source is just moving behind it. So that red object moving by is your source star, and then those blue images that are coming and going away are the distorted images of your distant source. So it's actually a transient event. And so in the case of most telescopes now, we're not actually able to resolve those images in most cases. And so instead, you just kind of see them all blended together. Like if you had 3 flashlights 100 feet away, you wouldn't necessarily be able to make out each of those individual flashlights. You would just see one brighter flashlight. And so you see an amplification of that distant source as it gets brighter and dimmer as the source passes behind that distant lens. And so the nice thing about this is that you only need the gravitational influence of your lens. You don't need to be able to see it. And that way we can discover invisible objects like black holes. And this was actually used to discover the first isolated stellar mass black hole. And so that was done in 2 groups, one led by Casey Lamb here at Berkeley, which I had the opportunity to be part of that team, and Kailash Sahu at the Space Telescope Science Institute. And it was found to be about 6 times the mass of our sun. So we've been talking about these astrophysical black holes, these black holes that come from exploding stars. And so these have all been less than about 100 times the mass of our sun. And then the next objects we're going to be talking about are about 100,000 times the mass of our sun or more massive. There's none in the between. These are known as intermediate mass black holes, and there's this mass gap that we don't understand why there's this difference. Usually we think that black holes grow either by getting gas from other objects or by merging together. So it's surprising that we don't see any black holes in between those masses. There's some theories for why that's the case, but it's still really an open question in science. So next, we're going to move on to those more massive categories. So these are known as supermassive black holes. And so there's the black hole at the center of our and every galaxy. This is an artist's representation of a galaxy, and there is a black hole in the center of all of those stars there. Yeah, we believe that there's a black hole at the center of every galaxy. But first I'll talk about our own. So our black hole is known as Sagittarius A star. And we were able to prove its existence by monitoring all of the stars at the center of our galaxy. So in this animation I'm about to show, this star here is actually, there's nothing there. When you look at images, there's nothing there. But that's just the point that you're going to see all these stars going around. And all of these objects here are stars. And, so over the course of 25 years, we've been able to monitor these stars, and you can see them orbiting around. These are zipping around. These stars are zooming on the sky. They're going way faster than they have any right to be, especially given that there's nothing visible here. And so they were able, based on the orbital parameters, to measure the mass of that central object, and it's thought to be 4 million times the mass of our sun. And back in 2020, Andrea Getz at UCLA and Reinhard Genzel, who spent some of his time at UC Berkeley, won the Nobel Prize for that in 2020. So next I'm going to talk about the iconic picture of a black hole that some of you may have seen in news headlines from the Event Horizon Telescope, or EHT. So this is a black hole in a different galaxy, a galaxy known as M87. And this is even an order of magnitude more massive than our black hole. This is 6 billion times the mass of our sun. And so you can see this image. You see this glowing red bit around. It's a little blurry. You also see the black in the middle where the black hole is. So let's look at a simulation that depicts what this is. So this is a simulation from NASA, and you can see there's the red part going around this glowing part. And so again, this is the accretion disk, so that's the material that the black hole was able to take from other stars or gas around it. And then it's going around and it's starting to glow. But it doesn't look flat, right? It looks like it has this thing up here and this thing down here. So the disk, why is that? And if you recall back to lensing, this is because the black hole is acting as a lens. It's having this disk going around it, and it's actually lensing the back side of the disk above and below it. So if the top side of the disk were purple and the bottom side were green, you would see that top part looking purple and that bottom part looking green. And that's a really cool thing. And so inside you have the dark spot where the black hole is and where light can't escape from. And so the way that they actually take this picture is not with a normal camera. First off, they're using radio waves. So they have these big satellite dish-looking things that are capturing radio waves, which are the same as the waves that are transmitting information to your radio. And they're using a technique called very long baseline interferometry. So rather than having one actual satellite dish the size of the Earth, they're able to sort of approximate it by kind of filling it in with different telescopes. So each of these points are a telescope on Earth, and they're all simultaneously taking observations of the same point in the sky. And then you can draw lines between each pair of them. And each of those different lines that you can draw, depending on the length of the line, can sort of fill in a part of the image. And then you can put all those together, and plus a lot of inference and a lot of code that can get you from one to the other to put together the image that looks like this. And given that it wasn't taken with a camera, even though it's blurry, it's still very high resolution. So the last method I'm going to talk about is quasars. So these are kind of the monsters of the universe. You have a black hole at the center of the galaxy, and it's able to get lots of material, has this accretion disk, and then it is able to produce these jets that are so powerful that could be 1,000 times brighter than the whole galaxy. And so, think of all those stars shining, it's 1,000 times brighter. And so they are produced. There's a lot of different theories as to why they're produced. It's likely that there's some magnetic field stirring up the particles, getting them super energetic, and pushing them out. And it's more likely to occur in galaxies with lots of gas that's available to be around. So just to summarize what we learned today, black holes are these bodies of immense density, such that light can't escape. Black holes less than about 1,000 times the mass of our sun come from stars, and we can find them via X-ray binaries, gravitational waves, astrometric wobbles, and microlensing. There's also supermassive black holes that are over 100,000 times the mass of our sun, which you can find using stellar motion, radio interferometry, and quasars, among other methods. Thank you.
So you always hear about black holes. It's like gravity pulling everything into it. Is that something that could eventually happen, that the black hole could get so big that it would have the power to pull galaxies into it, or other things?
Yeah, so one thing that isn't,
Do you mind repeating?
yes. So when you have a black hole, you hear often about them just sucking everything in. Is it possible for a black hole to get big enough that it starts to suck in entire galaxies or something like this? And so one thing I'll say is that it's a common misconception that black holes just kind of are able to just suck things in more than other things that are the same mass as them. So if, like, tomorrow our sun just became a black hole, besides the no light part, we would actually just happily keep orbiting around it. We wouldn't get sucked in any more than we get sucked into our sun. I guess in principle, like, if you, I guess we don't know of any method to make black holes grow so large that they would end up having a whole galaxy. But we would, I think, if you were in a stable orbit, you wouldn't be able to tell that it's even there. Yeah.
How big is the biggest black hole ever discovered?
How big is the biggest black hole we've ever discovered? I don't know if I know the exact number, but I would believe it'd be on the order of 10 billion times the mass of our sun. Yeah. Pretty massive. It's hard to wrap your mind around those sorts of numbers, right? Like past like a few thousand, it's hard to like for our human brains to comprehend them. Yeah.
Stella, your questioner, just asked about the size of the biggest black hole. I just want to know, when you told us, when you helped us picture a black hole, you drew a distinction between what's at the very center, maybe you called it the singularity, and the event horizon outside. Which of those two things defines the size of a black hole, physical, spatial size?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think generally we use the event horizon as the size of the black hole. I also did fib a little. There are different kind of radiuses that you can think of for a black hole. You can have the event horizon, and you can also, that can often be defined by what's called the Schwarzschild radius, but that's only for non-spinning black holes. When black holes spin, all sorts of funny things happen, and then that radius can actually get a little bit bigger.
The short what radius?
Schwarzschild radius.
Schwarzschild.
Yeah, it's a person's name.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question. So everybody always says that the universe is, nobody knows the end of it. But is the black hole, does anybody know? Probably not. What is inside that, and does that go forever? Just like, I mean.
Yeah, so general relativity will describe mathematically what happens in a black hole. And it is thought that there is some finite size in black holes. There's also all sorts of like these theories about, there's a lot of things that the math allows for that are astrophysically either impossible to probe or that are that we have not found evidence for. So you like may have seen Interstellar or something like this, where you like go through some portal in a black hole and come out the other side. But you, in that case, you would expect to see these other sides of black holes, but we don't. That's not to say it's impossible. Some things are mathematically allowed, but we don't have evidence for it.
So the missing mass part, the 100 to 100,000, this might be related to your previous answer, but techniques like the astrometric wobbles and microlensing, if black holes of those masses did exist, should they mathematically be able to be detected using those techniques?
Yeah, so the question was, can we use these sorts of techniques to probe intermediate mass black holes, the black holes between 100 and 100,000 times the mass of our sun? And the answer is absolutely yes, and people are trying. So there's another grad student in my lab who's actually looking for them at the Galactic Center. And so this is in this field, which is actually way more crowded than, like, way more stars here than are plotted here. And so basically, looking for stars that are orbiting around, looking for stars that are orbiting around those objects that we can't see, astrometric wobbles, and people are also using microlensing in what's called globular clusters. So that's like these really like dense star clusters that are actually thought to be like some of the oldest structures in the universe, which are these like clusters of stars that are on the outskirts of our galaxy. And it's thought that they might have intermediate mass black holes at the center of those.
Yeah, on this slide you mentioned that these stars are moving faster than they have any right to be. Can you give me like a percentage increase of how much faster they're moving than like either our sun or Earth itself?
The question is, how much faster are these stars moving than other objects like our sun or something like this? And so, I don't know if I remember the exact numbers. Basically the whole galaxy rotates at 220 kilometers per hour. And I believe these are moving at least double that, but I don't actually remember the number off the top of my head.
Can black holes actually bend time?
So that's a good question. The question is, can black holes actually bend time? And this falls into like the technically mathematically allowed portion from general relativity. So basically what happens is when you do all the equations, there's like a role that time plays and a role, there's two answers to your question. So basically, short answer is yes. Basically, like when you're moving relativistically, so that means close to the speed of light, you end up with what's called time dilation. And so the time that you would experience is different than the time that you would experience if you were not moving that quickly. And gravity also influences how the time is experienced in that way. And that is actually observed. We actually do have to take that into account when we have GPS satellites going around Earth. And whether they're on Earth or going around, they're experiencing different amounts of gravity and they're also moving quickly. And we actually have to take into account that difference when we calculate their clocks and stuff like that. Okay.
You were talking a while ago about binary black holes and that they collapse into one another and become a large one. I guess my question is, do they always collapse into one another, or do the orbits expand and they become independent? And what is it that erodes the orbit? Why do they collapse?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was, So do two binary black holes, do they always collapse into each other, or do they sometimes go out and become independent? And then what actually ends up making them spiral into each other? And the answer is absolutely yes, they sometimes come apart. They can come apart oftentimes due to what's called dynamical interactions. So when you have like a third body go by, you can potentially end up loosening them, and that can also tighten them. The expression is tighter binaries get tighter, and loose binaries get looser. That gets exacerbated by these dynamical encounters. And this can happen both, this is more likely to happen in crowded regions where you're likely to have these sorts of encounters. So the galactic center is one example of this. The globular clusters that I mentioned is another example where this is really common. And so that's one, yeah.
Is there a predominant theory of why each galaxy has a black hole in the center?
Yeah, so the question is there a predominant theory for why galaxies tend to have a supermassive black hole in the center? So there's, I think, a few different theories. One main theory is basically due to how the universe evolved. So the universe began much smaller than it is now, and then it started expanding and has expanded and is continuing to expand. And so at the beginning, though, it was super hot and it was super small. And so you kind of have these like fluctuations in density just out of randomness. Sometimes some spots would be a high density, some spots would be a low density. And then it was thought there was this thing called inflation that expanded the universe really rapidly. And then you ended up with these random overdensities and underdensities being kind of frozen out. And then when you have this overdensity, well, there's a lot of gravity, there's a lot of material there, started attracting more material. And so those are thought to potentially have collapsed to form the black hole. Maybe they were able to attract the other material that formed the galaxy, or maybe just other material formed there because of the overdensity, but it likely has something to do with that.
Yeah, you described how the image of the black hole with the black in the center and the orange around the outside was produced by multiple widely spaced radio telescopes on Earth. Presumably they're all detecting a single frequency at the same time.
Yeah.
A single radio frequency. So my question is, do black holes emit other radio frequencies, and were they detected? And if they were, what kind of image would you see if you tuned them all to a different frequency?
That's a good question. So the question is basically, so we have this network of radio telescopes that was that took the picture of the black hole. The question is, were they all tuned to the same frequency? Are two black holes only emit at one frequency, or do they emit in a spectrum of frequencies? And if you were to change the frequency, how would the image change? And so the question is absolutely yes, the black holes emit in many different frequencies. It's known as a spectrum of frequencies. And so basically when they determine the bandpass they want to measure at, in this case, so they've been able to take pictures of two black holes, both one in M87, and then I don't have a picture of it, but they also took a picture of our black hole, Sagittarius A star. I believe they calculated what the optimal wavelength was to look at based on the peak of that spectrum. They wanted to get the most signal. And so a lot of work has been done, especially actually for quasars. So quasars, they actually do have this like accretion disk as well. So this is an artist representation. But for the case of M87, we've actually taken a picture at a different frequency and have been able to see with a different frequency and different resolution and different field of view. So field of view is just like, basically, are you zoomed in or are you zoomed out? And so you can actually, I didn't put this in here, but they have like, you can see the jet, and then you can zoom in at different frequencies, and you can learn a lot about the object that way, because different black holes do have different ranges of frequencies depending on the material that they're absorbing, their mass, the material around it, is it dusty around it, is it obscured, stuff like that. So it's quite dependent on those type of black holes.
I'm sorry, I have one more question. So you're talking about when the universe started and it was small. And I guess my question has always been, there had to be something there before it started. Does anybody ever talk about what was there before the universe started? I mean, it can't have come from nothing.
I mean, potentially. So people do talk about it, but I think it's often more of a philosophical question than an astrophysical one. To repeat the question, was there, did something come before the universe, and do we think about that? And potentially, like, some people would think about how we could probe that. If there are some theories. So one idea is there was a big bounce. So if, like, the universe started out small, maybe there was another universe before that collapsed, and then we were a big bounce. Like, now we think the universe is expanding and accelerating, but if it had a lot more mass and we're actually going to collapse instead, maybe it would collapse and then bounce out again or something like that. So sometimes people think about, are there ways that we could probe that question? But unlike a lot of the phenomena that are in the universe where we can say, okay, we're going to look for it this way, a lot of the time when the question is not how are we going to look for something, that's like a more theoretical or philosophical question.
Well, it's hard to imagine that there was something. It's hard to imagine that there's no end. I think it's beyond our brain to imagine that there's no end.
Yeah, I mean, part of why I love to study astronomy is that, like, it reminds me that I'm small, right, in the universe. Both for the good things and the bad things. If I have a bad day, I'm small, it's okay.
When you were talking about the singularity, you referred to it as being a point. But I would think that there would be some kind of limit to how densely atoms can pack together. So there must be some physical size to it, right?
Yeah, so this is what general relativity describes. And
for the camera, the question?
Yes, is the singularity a point, or it must have some physical size because of the way that atoms, how close atoms can get and stuff like that. And so basically how a black hole, I'll divert the question slightly and tell you how a black hole is formed astrophysically. So basically what happens is that when a star explodes and you have your core in the center, then basically what happens is that it really doesn't want to collapse. The atoms don't want to get close to each other. So there's something called there's something called degeneracy pressure. So basically what happens first is that the electrons don't want to get close to each other. It's called electron degeneracy pressure. They each have their own address. They have their fluidification, they have what's called their spin, they have their mass, and they do not want to get close to each other. But eventually, sometimes the mass will get too massive and it'll collapse. It will then collapse. And then what happens next is that it forms a neutron star. And the neutron degeneracy pressure is stronger than electron degeneracy pressure. And the neutrons say, I don't want to get close to each other. And then what happens next is that there's enough mass that that gets overwhelmed. And then we believe that a black hole is formed. And so there's this idea called the no-hair theorem. There's lots of funny names for these things, which is basically like when you have a neutron star or a white dwarf, which are these really, really dense objects. So like, for example, a neutron star is like the mass of our sun and the size of Manhattan. And so, like, when that happens, we believe that you can't actually, or sorry, for the white dwarf and the neutron star, you can tell what material they're made out of. Whereas for a black hole, it's just described by its mass, its spin, and its charge. And so, you know, we don't believe that you can figure out like what it's made of, and that the atoms are no longer holding up the pressure.
Can you define the big bounce?
Yeah, so
Opposite of bang?
So the question was, can you define the big bounce? So this is a purely theoretical idea, so we believe that the universe started with the Big Bang, right? But this is a potential idea that if something had come before, or if the universe weren't expanding and if it were rather contracting and it was going to come together and then it was going to, if it were going to collapse again, potentially there could be another Big Bang. So the idea is that there was a universe, it collapsed, and then there was a Big Bang, and that's the big bounce.
Thank you.
Sure.
You described Sagittarius A star as the black hole in the Milky Way. Is there a place we could point to in the night sky from here and say, there, approximately there's the black hole?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. I can tell you how to find it if you know some constellations. So if you know Cygnus, the Swan constellation, it forms like a cross on the sky. And if you go down a little bit more, you'll see the galactic center. And so that's where, so this is an artist representation of the Milky Way. We don't have a probe outside, but that center there, I have a thing. That center there is where all of the stars are most dense, and that is where the central black hole is, Sagittarius A star. And so yeah, if you keep going down past Cygnus, then that's where the galactic center is, and that's approximately where the black hole is.
Oh, great, thank you.
So in the constellation Sagittarius?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why it's called Sagittarius A star.
Got it. I have a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
About 6 or 7 years ago, I mean, when I used to teach integrated science in high school, there were approximately 6 billion galaxies. And then I recall reading a piece about 6 or 7 years ago, no, we're off by about 1 trillion. There are, 1 trillion, 600 billion galaxies. What's the current estimate of the number of galaxies in our universe?
So the question is, what's the current estimated number of galaxies in the universe? I guess, short answer, I don't actually know the number off the top of my head. But I'm sure that number is easily accessible, but I'm sure that also the number is wrong. I'm sure, like, the JWST, the James Webb Space Telescope is like our newest great, telescope that was launched, and it has been especially powerful for doing galactic science. It is able to probe deeper and fainter than any other telescope doing similar science. And so that's likely why the number is amended. But astronomy in general is a data-driven field. Whenever we turn on a new telescope, we learn lots of new things. And so, I don't know for sure that the number is wrong. I don't have a specific reason to believe something like this. But oftentimes when we turn on a new telescope, we learn just all sorts of new things.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Or, sorry.
Continually more black holes that we will be discovering.
That we will
be discovering.
Yeah.
And also that will be forming.
Uh-huh.
Is that right?
Yeah, so the question is that, are we going to continue to discover black holes, and are they going to continue to form? And the answer for both of those questions is yes.
One of the great questions in science, maybe the greatest, is one of the greatest answers, is I don't know. And you heard that answer tonight, beautifully spoken, as well as an addition to it, and even if I knew the answer, it would be wrong. That's beautiful. I want to ask for your indulgence here. both Will and Natasha have their microphones still on. I'd like them to explain briefly what got them hooked in their respective fields. Will gave us a hint about his upbringing. Maybe he'll explain again, and then Natasha will tell us what hooked her up with astronomy and black holes.
Yeah, I can begin. So I got interested in marine science from watching the results of the blob. So I was a diver at this time, and like I said, we were coming to this coastline, and I was getting in the water, hopefully, every weekend with my family. We were camping, we're looking for food, we're part of a community. And the results of that were pretty devastating. Things up to the point of rolling dead shells up the beach in every wave, and the ocean, like, it had lost something to me. So that's kind of what pushed me to come here, is like, I want to know why that happens, why are these things connected, and what can I do to potentially help?
For me, I've always been interested in math and physics and, looking up at the sky. In late middle school, I did Science Olympiad, this science competition that you can do from regionally to nationally if your team makes it. And there was an event called Reach for the Stars. And I did that event, and I was like, wow, you can actually study this formally. And I, in high school, had the opportunity. I emailed a ton of different professors in the area and did research. I'm from New Jersey, and so I did research at the Natural History Museum in New York City with the professor there, who was nice enough to take me under his wing, and I absolutely loved it. I was studying galaxies there, and just kind of ran with it ever since.
Will you join me in another round of applause for